It's 1:55 a.m., September 5th, 1944, and I've been on the train just 45 minutes. The porter probably thinks that I've made at least 20 trips across the country before, because I'm acting as though I'm a woman of the world.
It's the fall of 1944, and 20-year-old Doris Blumberg is on a 5-day journey to California. Her destination is the Monroe Army Base, where she'll work as a mathematician for the United States Army on a top-secret project to perfect precision aerial bombing. Back home in Philadelphia, her twin sister Shirley is also an Army mathematician, working at the University of Pennsylvania as a ballistics calculator. Just a few years earlier, these bright young women may have faced low-paying jobs as school teachers or secretaries. But in a world at war, their mathematical skills proved invaluable to the United States military. Like thousands of other women across the country, Doris and Shirley had been recruited to work for the war effort. But unlike their blue-collar sisters, these Rosies worked as human computers, using their math skills to compute shell trajectories, create ballistics tables, and serve as programmers on ENIAC, the first electronic computer. When they signed on for the duration, these young women hoped that their secret work would help win World War II. They did not know how it would change their own lives, nor could they know that they were helping to usher in the computer age that would change the world.
Well, Grace Ferry was not the garden spot of Philadelphia. It was not a beautiful area to grow up. It was at the time we were growing up, predominantly Catholic, a mixture of Italian and Irish, mainly. There was a synagogue 5 blocks away at 23rd and Wharton Street, and a number of the professional people in the neighborhood, the pharmacist and the doctor across the street, the dentist a few blocks away. Most of those people were Jewish, but we didn't feel any discrimination in our neighborhood. I don't think that there was any major problem with being Jewish in the all-Catholic neighborhood. Now, I always say we because, as you know, I have a twin sister, and we did everything together. So we went to a girls' high from Ordinary Junior High. Girls' high was a pleasure. One teacher I remember, Miss Clark, was probably, I think, one of the best teachers I've ever had. And she started a math club, which she invited both of us to join. So we would do math games after school at the math club, and it was just a lot of fun.
I grew up in Missouri on a farm, and my father was a school teacher and a farmer. And we were very poor. I mean, if I had a quarter, I had a lot of money. We grew most of our own food and just bought staples at the store. And the little town of Atlantis, they used to have silent movies, and they used to play it up on the wall of one of the stores. And they just had planks, so you'd sit and you'd go on Saturday night and see the silent movie.
My mother was a stay-at-home mom, which most women were in those days. And my father was a traveling salesman, and he traveled from Boston to Washington and out to Lancaster and York. In the summertime, I would go with him sometimes. But being raised, I guess, in that household, I just knew that I had to go to college. I mean, it was expected, and I knew I was going to go.
Now, my mother, of course, didn't have any formal education. I only went through 8th grade. She never went to high school at all. But she was as encouraging as everybody else, you know. This is a new world, you know. You can't make it in this world without an education. And I didn't have the opportunity. I wish I had had the opportunity. But you do have the opportunity, so there is no choice. This is what you do.
I never wanted to live on a farm. I never wanted to marry a farmer. I never wanted to have kids. I wasn't going to have, and my Aunt Gretchen, who didn't get married till she was 40 and didn't have any children, was my model. Because she used to come home in the summer and She wore makeup and had hand marker suits, and that's how I went to college. As Aunt Gretchen, I borrowed the grand total of $400 to go to college. I knew I wanted to do something like Aunt Gretchen. I wanted to get out of Missouri, and I wanted to go to some place, some big place.
We interrupt this broadcast to bring you this important bulletin.
We were playing bridge, and somebody ran in and said, Japan is bombing Pearl Harbor. So we all jumped up and we ran in, and we all listened to the radio. And of course, Roosevelt declared war the next day.
Members of the Senate, of the House of Representatives, yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
It was the beginning of people waking up to the fact that you can't sit by and let everybody else do your job for you.
The United States, once World War II breaks out, is able to turn to industry in this country, and they were very readily able to turn their production from peacetime services to wartime production very, very, very quickly.
I think one of the things that surprises people about women in, say, the 20s and 30s is that they were generally better educated than their male counterparts. At both the high school and at the college level, represented about half of the students. Now, where it was different for women is the range of professional and occupational activities.
During the war, the opportunities for women expand numerically, and they also change in terms of what's available to them. There is an increase of about 50% more women in the workforce between 1940 and 1945.
So World War II was an opportunity for many women to leave their homes and take on jobs in a variety of industries. The aircraft industry, you know, we all know the image of Rosie the Riveter. For women with mathematical training, ballistics computing was a job newly open to women because men were recruited for wartime service.
For us, a computer is a thing, an object that performs tasks both mundane and amazing. But in 1942, a computer wasn't a machine, it was a person. The profession of human computing can be traced back to the 17th century in occupations such as astronomy, architecture, and engineering. By the end of the 19th century, the formal word computer was a professional title applied to people who spent their lives computing. Whether calculating astronomical tables or factoring missile trajectories, mathematics was a crucial weapon of the U.S. arsenal, and women, its secret practitioners.
I graduated from West Philadelphia High School in 1938. I went to Temple. And I went into the secondary education department and graduated from there in 42, knowing I did not want to be a teacher and looking for whatever else I could find. I minored in business, so I did learn adding machine. If all else failed, I could get a job in an office because I had shorthand and typing and that to fall back on. But when I got out of school, the war was on, and there were other opportunities.
Well, the call came originally from Dr. Hart, from Dr. Olive Eli Hart, as I recall. She's the one who called us in and told us that all of the principals of all the high schools had received this message that the war effort in the Department of Defense was looking for young students who had ability in math for a war program that would be a great contribution to the country.
Yeah, we knew we had to do it. We knew we had to help out. If we were sending our troops over there to risk their lives, we certainly had to help out on this end. In whatever capacity we had some skills in.
During World War II, there were a whole lot of ballistic labs that were operating. East Coast, West Coast, middle of the country. Remember, World War II is a total war, and it became a national effort. So anywhere that a university had a mathematics department, they had folks work at these tables.
During World War I, Congress acquired thousands of acres of Maryland farmland to to create Aberdeen Proving Ground, the Army's major site for ballistics research and weapons testing. World War II brought intense demands for updated ballistics information, and the Ordnance Department of Aberdeen could not keep up. The Army contracted with the University of Pennsylvania to establish a classified satellite lab in nearby Philadelphia at the Moore School of Engineering. Shirley, Doris, and Marlon joined young women from across the country to form the Philadelphia Computing Section.
We worked in 2 shifts. I don't remember, I think 7:30 to 4 and 4:30 to 1, I think, more or less. And there were 3 floors, and on our floor there were about 10 women.
We did the problem solving with the help of these great big Marchands and Monroes and great big ugly calculators that made a lot of noise and mistakes too. Every once in a while it would shut off and we'd have to start all over again, you know. They were pretty old pieces of equipment.
We assume that once we can mathematically define something, that we can then solve those mathematical equations. And it turns out there are whole classes of problems that we can't easily solve, we can approximate. And differential equations fall into that category.
What is a differential equation as compared with an algebraic equation? An algebraic equation is something where everything is standing still, except that you've got to put your finger on the number you want within that mess. And so you substitute, you go through x's and so forth, and you come out, the answer is 4. Nothing changed while you were doing this. However, in talking things about projectiles going through the air, you have things that are constantly changing even as the thing itself is moving.
It's advanced mathematics, and those equations were solved in order to figure out the trajectory of a bullet or a bomb, just exactly where it started, what the muzzle velocity was of whatever it was that was shooting this bullet, and where it was going. We knew the distance, and we had to figure out how it was going to get there, to exactly where it had to land. And the differential equations were part of the solution of the trajectory.
They were integrating on a digital basis, step by step, what my analyzer was running by wheels and gears and turning around.
Penn's Moore School of Engineering owned a Bush differential analyzer, one of only 5 in the world. This huge mechanical calculating machine was invented by Vannevar Bush at MIT in 1925 and was state-of-the-art technology at the Moore School in 1942. Doris was one of 6 female computers assigned to run ballistics problems on the machine. A typical shell trajectory involves thousands of individual calculations. Using the differential analyzer, Doris's team could compute a 60-second shell trajectory in only 15 minutes, while human computers, such as Shirley and Marlon, worked 40 hours to complete the same trajectory.
Girls were working in there, yes, we had 2 shifts of them. And there were about 3 girls that worked each shift. So that when we set up a new run, it was to run down the line and set up all 8 indicators to the initial conditions. And then with a prayer, fingers crossed, you went up and pushed the button and started the time motor. And it made this whole machine start grinding.
It was run by gears. The gears would get loose, and Joe Chaplin would climb underneath and tighten the gears. When we'd say, "Hey, Joe, there are too many mistakes coming out of this machine," he would go underneath there and tighten the gears and figure out what was wrong with it.
Weapons capable of hurling 300-pound projectiles many miles with amazing accuracy.
In warfare, accuracy is vital. Ground artillery tested on the former farmland of Aberdeen Proving Ground functioned differently on the sands of African beaches. With newly developed weapons constantly rolling off assembly lines, new ballistics tables were desperately needed. The Philadelphia Computing Section produced individual shell trajectories. These calculations were then sent to Aberdeen to be compiled into tables, printed and bound into manuals, and the manuals shipped around the world to soldiers in the field.
We were very close, those of us on that floor. We were pretty close, and we did talk. We were told that the guns reached the soldiers before the firing tables did, and we felt that it was very important to get this done and over to them.
We knew that what we were doing was important, and that it was very secret, and that being there was a good thing.
We usually had enough women working those 3 shifts to get the project done in time, but if we weren't finished in time, we double shifted.
No, we didn't have vacations, so we didn't take time off from work. We worked 1 shift, 2 shifts, 3 shifts sometimes, depending upon what was needed. Yeah, it was tough.
This is mission number 1, September the 19th, 1944. We were scheduled to bomb the marshalling yards, the railroad yards in Hamm, Germany, but we actually bombed Osnabrück, Germany. It was a visual target, and we were in the first group, the high group. We assembled through 2 layers of
clouds, 1,000 to 3,000 feet, and then 5,000 to 7,500, and got the formation together and were headed toward the coast. It was a wonderful feeling seeing all the wings of ships everywhere. The sky was full of us.
I joined not so much out of patriotism as the fact that the draft board was breathing a hot breath on my neck, like the most of us guys in 1942. They said I was too small to be a bomber pilot. And I said, I can handle anything. And they said, no, you can't. So anyway, I wound up going to Bombardier and Navigation School, graduated, went on to join up with a crew on a B-17 Flying Fortress.
The B-17, the Army Air Corps' legendary Flying Fortress, flew with a crew of 10 men in massive formations. 3 squadrons of 12 planes formed a typical bombing group. These groups of 36 planes, taking off from temporary air bases on country estates all over England, assembled in the air for missions over the European continent. Formations of hundreds of planes assured that some would evade anti-aircraft fire and reach their target. Careful as ballistics calculations were, precision bombing was not perfect. And so, massive formations carpet-bombed targeted areas. The pilot relied on his bombardier, crouched behind a clear plastic bubble in the nose of the plane. The lead plane's bombardier operated the technologically sophisticated and top-secret Norden bomb sight, and when he released his bombs, this was a signal to the other bombardiers to release theirs.
So, off we went. From the initial point, I would have the bomb. So I would look in, and I would adjust one knob so that the one crosshair would be actually on the target. Then you'd throw a button and the other index would come up. When these 2 indices met, that was bombs away. These figures that you pumped into the bomb site were the result of some dear people back in the States figuring, using a comptometer and a slide rule, and they came up with these ballistic figures.
One of the problems they had in World War II with Norden bomb site and bombing in particular was that all these tables had been worked out in perfect clarity of air. But when they went to Europe, the cloud cover moved in. The air temperature, air density are different. So they had it within the ballpark, but they didn't have it exactly. So if you got a bomb within 500 yards of a target, you were doing really good. And that's why they use these massive formations of bombers to drop huge amounts of bombs on a target to make sure they hit the target. Now, when you do that, there's a lot of collateral damage. And in World War II, a city becomes a target.
Geographically, there was an area right close to the confluence of the English Channel and the North Sea where the RAF could, if they came back with a load of bombs, couldn't drop, because it was not a good idea to go to war with 8,000 pounds of bombs, couldn't drop them, come back and land with them. You know what I mean? So there was this area that you would drop them in the English Channel. Now what our policy used to be, and I guess the Lord will hold somebody responsible for it, don't find a target of opportunity. If Berlin is so fogged in you can't go, if such your primary target, find a target of opportunity. We were going up over the North Sea, over Heligoland, down the Baltic, and into Berlin that way. Couldn't get in. We were up to about 35,000 feet. And the service ceiling on a 17 was 36, and the thing was flying practically like this. And we got up over Denmark and then come back. And that was one of the times that we dropped our bombs on a target of opportunity, which was a dear little town in Holland, which we shouldn't have done, but we did.
Allied patrols on the Anzio front below Rome are in constant contact with the enemy. Troops blazing away within sight of a Nazi outpost.
We had some big shots from Washington come up in military uniforms, colonels or generals or whatever they were, to give us an award. It was a piece of paper, but I don't know what happened to those pieces of paper, but it was one for the whole unit, telling us that this was a major success, United States victory in some part of Europe, and one of them was Anzio.
The Battle of Anzio is an attempt to outflank the Germans, land in behind their lines, get in behind them, and disrupt them and force them to withdraw. Unfortunately, it's not pressed vigorously enough. The Germans are able to react and pin us into a beachhead, and it became sort of a shooting gallery.
When I read about the landing on the beaches at Anzio in the newspapers, I got physically ill from the bloodbath that happened there. I mean, thousands of people were bleeding on the beaches. It was absolutely horrible, that landing. And I thought about that for a long time. I lost some sleep over that.
World War II gave birth to the modern military-industrial complex, a partnership of government funding, industrial capacity, and university brainpower that produced astounding technological leaps. The Army was constantly developing and testing new weapons and new technologies, and under the pressure of war would try anything. There was a bomb containing live bats rigged with incendiary devices, a $2 million research project that went nowhere. But then there was radar. There was the Manhattan Project. And there was a crazy idea that came out of the Moore School of Engineering at Penn.
The Aberdeen people were building up their staff. One of the things they did was to rake over the mathematical divisions in various colleges. And one of the men they got was Herman Goldstein. He was from Chicago. He had a PhD in mathematics. And shortly after he came on board, and of course he and I worked together because he's always coming in to see how's the analyzer doing. And the analyzer room was down in the basement, and there were 2 steps down into the place where the analyzer was. And so you could stand on this top step and look down on the whole scene. And he and I were standing there, and Herman says, "You know, when we got this thing in Aberdeen, we thought it was the greatest thing since bottled beer. And now it seems so damn slow." And I said, well, you know, you should talk to a guy upstairs named John Mockley who has ideas of how to do it electronically. Oh, can I meet him? I said, sure.
John Mockley was a young physics professor researching weather prediction at the Moore School, and J. Presper Eckert was a brilliant graduate student in engineering. To speed up his calculations, Mockley had conceived of a radical new machine, an entirely electronic digital calculator, and Eckert wanted to help build it. Back in the desperate spring of 1943, Captain Herman Goldstein had escorted Mockley and Eckert to Aberdeen Proving Ground to pitch their idea to the Army brass. The trio of eggheads was elated when the Try Anything Army agreed to fund their project. The development of ENIAC, the electronic, numerical, integrator, and computer, was underway.
We knew that these two guys were in this room right off the differential analyzer room and that they were inventing something, but we had no idea what they were inventing until much later when they had this great big machine up against the wall and lots of lights and wires coming to it, and they invited a couple of us in there and said, "Want to see something?" And they took us in and we said, "What's that?" And they said, "That's going to be the first electronic computer, and that's going to do the work that you're doing in seconds." And so we said, "Yeah, go dream on, you crazy guys," you know? And it was ENIAC.
I don't know that I thought it was important, but I didn't think it was a folly. I thought it was going to come up with this information. I didn't realize that it could be used in civilian life. I assumed it was, you know, something that the Army would be able to use.
Bulletin. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, June 6. General Dwight D. Eisenhower's headquarters announced today that Allied troops began landing...
Despite the success of the Allied invasion of Europe on D-Day, by December 1944, the Allies suffer setbacks in Belgium during the Battle of the Bulge and realize that the war with Hitler will not end soon. Progress on ENIAC is slow, and the Philadelphia computing section is overwhelmed by demands from Aberdeen for ballistics calculations. Captain Goldstein and the Moore School faculty need more female computers. They launch a new recruitment effort, writing to associations of university women and to mathematics departments across the country.
I graduated in college in 1945. I was looking for other things, and my calculus teacher knew that I didn't want to teach school, and she said, "Oh, there are lots of things you can do." She had a recruitment letter from Aberdeen Proving Ground, and they wanted girl math majors to apply for a job at the University of Pennsylvania at the Moore School. Well, I applied for the job and I didn't hear from them. So I went home to wait for this great job offer. And then my father would come home almost every day with another school that needed a math teacher. I said, "No, I'm waiting," and people would ask me, "You know, what are you doing?" I'm waiting, and when they hired me, they sent a telegram, and it said, "Report immediately." So I was on the Wabash the next midnight out of town.
It is spring 1945, and Philadelphia, like other cities, large and small across the United States, booms with wartime activity. The Naval Yard builds warships, clothing factories produce uniforms, war workers pack crowded rooming houses, and the streets come alive in the off hours. Young people far away from home with good wages in their pockets are experiencing new freedom.
I think I started at $1,280 or $60 a year. And that was fair pay at that time. But then when we made $1,800 a year, that was fantastic. We went up in rank, and I think up to 2,000.
We were considered to be very highly paid, and we didn't pay much attention to that either, but I remember hearing my mother brag about how much money we made working out there in the unit, you know. My mother would say, "Guess what the girls are making," you know. She could hardly believe it.
We had a nice social life somehow or other. We squeezed that in with all the other activities.
We didn't worry about the men in our lives because there weren't any. And we all, so to speak, let our hair down and we did whatever we felt like doing that we could afford to do on $2,000 a year.
I remember having picnics. We would go out on a picnic on a Sunday every once in a while, and we had a lot of fun, and we tried to forget about what we were doing during the week, you know, and just have a good time.
Sometimes when we were there late on Saturday night, Florence usually, because she was very good at it, would put words to songs, to tunes, and we would sing. All of us would hold the papers and sing. I can't sing. I can't sing. I'll just mouth it for you. It was, I'm trying to think of the name of the song if you wouldn't know the tune anyway. It was Saturday night at PCS, because we were the Philadelphia Computing Section. That's what they called us. Saturday night at PCS, computers want to play. Instead of pushing the Monroe keys, this is what they say, and then we went on from there. Why I remember that 60 years later, I can't tell you, but I do.
President Truman officially announces the end of German resistance.
General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations. The flags of freedom fly all over Europe.
Victory in Europe brought wild rejoicing throughout the Allied world as the Big Three announced the downfall of Nazi Germany.
I just remember that the announcement came over the radio that the war in Europe was over, and oh boy, we really had the time of our lives. We went outside and danced in the gardens at Penn and just had a great time celebrating.
There's a hard road ahead before we bring Japan to her knees, and it's up to us to get back on the job until complete victory is assured.
We went back to the office because the war in Japan wasn't over yet, and we did not know if the work we were doing was for Japan or for Europe. We had no idea.
After VE Day, the war effort didn't slacken at all, really, because everybody believed that the war would still go on for a long time because the island hopping in the South Pacific they're really bloody. People just thought it was going to take years to wipe the Japanese out of all these islands.
In the Battle of Okinawa, though, it had been decided that we needed something that could take out Japanese defenses on what was known as the reverse slope. Remember, the Japanese didn't give up. They fought to the last. So there's also then the realization that if we invade Japan, we're going to use chemicals on them. We're going to use mustard gas on them. So there had to be an entire new collection effort made on ballistic tables for things like mustard gas weapons. This was going to turn into a very nasty affair if we had to invade Japan.
The Japanese troops were in trenches. And I remember discussing with the guys, the bosses who were in charge of getting this work out, that there were 3 different positions and that there were 3 different formulae that we were using then. And one of them was if they were in prone position, standing position, or if they were lying flat. And that kind of got to me. I think that's why I remember it so clearly, because it made it more personal. I thought, my God, what are we doing here?
After the war, we did go over to Germany, and I saw chapels and cathedrals and so forth in towns that had been bombed by us, some of the things I was on. And I thought, boy, that's horrible. And when we came back, we came back and went to an American cemetery. And all I could think of was, those bastards, they deserved it.
For many, many years, even when the children, my older children, were certainly old enough to understand what we did during the war effort, I never discussed it with them. I never mentioned ballistics. I never mentioned the unit or anything like that. And it kind of came as a surprise to them when we finally opened up and told them what we did during the war. I still don't feel like there's something that I could kind of brag about, you know, that this was a tough thing to get your mind set on, you know, and to accept for yourself.
I'm a different man than I was 60 years ago. I mean, really. I like to think that I'm a better man, morally. I'm not an over-religious guy. I do go to church every Sunday. I happen to be a Roman Catholic because my wife was. I mean, it was a job. I mean, I certainly, years later, I was not proud of it, and I have had thoughts run through my mind occasionally when my day is to go to St. Peter, and I say, here I am, and he gets the book out and says, well, I'm just wondering how many souls I would be personally responsible for, particularly having been a lead bombardier. I don't know. I mean, it's done, it's happened, there's nothing I can do about it. Remember, I was not an infantryman. I never faced a guy like you, and you, and shot or stabbed you. I was 5 miles up, messing around with a bunch of levers, as if I might be working in a machine shop. Pushed a lever, like as if I was turning off a light. And it wasn't the same effect as one-on-one. But there were a few times that you can't help but think of that, but you don't dwell on it.
Programming did not exist before the 1940s because there were no computers except for human computers. And when the Army decided to create a machine to automate the same computing work that was done by humans, because this labor was done by females, once the actual machine was designed largely by male engineers working for the Army and working at the University of Pennsylvania, someone's work was needed to set up problems on the machine. This was the work of the first programmers. And because women had been primarily engaged in the human computing work, they were invited to program the first machine.
Well, Herman was the one that interviewed us for the ENIAC. Now, I had only been here, I came the 30th of April, and so it was in June when they were recruiting people as programmers for the ENIAC. So there was a notice came around that anybody that would want to be a programmer could come to this meeting on a particular day for an interview for it. So 13 of us showed up.
The field of electronic computing is so new that Captain Goldstein hardly knows what to ask the applicants in their interviews. Because they will be handling plugs, cables, and switches, he finally asks them if they're afraid of electricity. From this process, 6 women are chosen, but they cannot see the classified ENIAC until the War Department upgrades their security clearance. As the summer of 1945 comes to a close, they teach themselves how to program the first computer by studying block diagrams.
Well, there were about 18,000 vacuum tubes, and it had 20 accumulators, and each accumulator had 10 decade counters and 1 sign counter. When I can remember the day that we figured out how the master programmer works, we were wondering, how can you fit all this stuff on here? And so Kay popping up and saying, you can repeat it. You can use the master programmer.
The labor of setting up problems on the machine was conceived of by project engineers as largely clerical, not that important. But when we actually look in detail at what these first programmers were doing, we see it required familiarity with a completely untested machine. They were the ones who made the machine work.
Ruth and Marlon were assigned the job of calculating a trajectory exactly the same way the ENIAC did. So we had a test program. What we would do, we would run the test trajectory, and if it came out okay, then we would run the real trajectory, and then we would run the test trajectory again. And if both test trajectories came out all right, we assumed what was in between would. This trajectory that Marlon and Ruth did is what gave us usefulness in the eyes of the engineers, because with this program, we could debug the ENIAC down to a vacuum tube.
So in some ways, programming the ENIAC is not at all like programming a modern computer. The ENIAC was several different machines, and in some ways, programming meant plugging one machine into another in a path that would solve your particular problem. And programming becomes much more than that as computers become more flexible. On the other hand, I do think it was underestimated, both at the time and today. So if you talk to somebody like Jean Bartik, she will tell you the important role she had in debugging the system, figuring out what was wrong, and very quickly, I think people realize that it's not just the machine, it's the machine plus the program that solves the problem, and you can't easily separate the two in the way that the ENIAC project leaders had hoped they could.
A lot of us got together and said our country wouldn't do anything like that. In somebody else's land, drop something that's that dangerous to the people that could possibly go on for generations. You know, our country wouldn't do that. It must have been somebody else who did it. We didn't believe that the United States would drop the atomic bomb.
It scared me. I was very frightened at the whole idea of the atomic bomb. I don't recall feeling regret that they had used it, however. I had mixed feelings about that.
The long World War is finally over, but a new war is beginning, a Cold War, fueled by a nuclear arms race between former allies. While ENIAC was not completed in time to contribute to World War II, the scientists who developed the atomic bomb recognized that its unprecedented calculating power can speed their research into the next generation of nuclear weapons. Two members of J. Robert Oppenheimer's Los Alamos team travel from New Mexico to Philadelphia to run a complex problem on ENIAC. This highly classified problem involved calculations for a nuclear trigger for the hydrogen bomb. This first triumphant test of ENIAC thrills the Los Alamos scientists. At this moment, two of the U.S. Army's most top secret and wildly speculative World War II projects converge.
Two men came from Los Alamos, Stan Frankel and Nick Metropolis, and they had programmed a problem to run on the ENIAC. They had been there and talked to the engineers and had gotten the drawings also. So they came with their problem, and Fran and Kay worked with them. And the first time we saw the ENIAC was the day we put Nick and Stan's problem on it. And Herman Goldstein stood out in the middle like a conductor of an orchestra, and he called out, accumulator, well, this is accumulator 20, switch 1, receive on the alpha digit tray, and the program pulse A1. And so anyway, we all were assigned units, and we sat by the units and did exactly whatever he told us to do. And that's how we installed that first program on the ENIAC.
In 1945, Frankel and Metropolis came to Penn to see if the ENIAC might be used to help them with the calculations for creating this weapon. And who was it who helped them out? It was the women. This was the first time the machine had ever been used. So there's no question that they were doing pioneering and important work.
It was announced to the press on the 1st of February, but they were not allowed to announce it in their papers until the formal introduction on the 14th. Well, I understand that the demonstration was pretty dismal, and right afterward, Herman Goldstein invited Betty and me over to their apartment in West Philadelphia. He asked if the trajectory would be ready to go for the demonstration on the 14th, if we could get it, and we said yes. We'd never programmed a problem, so what did we know how much trouble we were going to have? Betty and I, we worked night and day, so that everything was hunky-dory until the night before the demonstration. The shell didn't stop when it hit the ground. It dug a hole. We couldn't figure out what on earth was going wrong. So I've always said that Betty uses more logic in her sleep than most people do awake. So that night, she had her nighttime logic working, and the next morning, she came in and knew exactly which switch on the master programmer to change and to stop it when it hit the ground. So it was a fantastic demonstration.
Photographers and journalists were invited on several occasions to come in and see what exactly was the ENIAC, what could it do, who was involved, and archival records show that women were photographed, but these photographs never appeared in articles written by the journalists or never were published in newspapers and magazines. So many of the men engineers received publicity while the female computers and programmers did not. As far as the official publicity that was staged in February 1946, that was organized by the War Department and pretty tightly controlled in terms of what journalists and other people attending saw. Betty Jean Jennings and Betty Snyder developed the demonstration trajectory program. Again, they were the ones who made the machine do the things that we all got very excited about, but their participation was never mentioned in either War Department press releases or later news reports that relied on those publicity materials.
I think that World War II's biggest impact on women was a psychological impact, the ability to do something that you were told you would never be able to do, that you couldn't do, that you were incapable of doing. And for women, whether working as engineers, as mathematicians, or as welders, they learned something about themselves that was really important.
These computers, these ladies that computed these firing tables, it was absolutely vital work. And without their contribution to the war effort, we would have lost World War II. We could not have won World War II without that data.
I was at a museum that had an exhibit about the ENIAC recently, and it had a very traditional picture. It had Eckert and Mauchly, and then it had this label and the ENIAC women. And I told the curator of that exhibit, we've known for a long time who these women are. They're a crucial part of this story. You need to change the label on this because they are so important. But this was a few years ago, and their story has still been neglected.
For whatever reason, those were very happy years for us. And it shouldn't have been, but it was. We were extremely happy doing whatever we were doing at that time.
I'm glad we had the skills and that they dragged us in there and said, go do it. And I'm glad we were able to help in that much. And not only the two of us, but all those other wonderful women who came in and did that work.
Well, I've always said that I was the luckiest person in the world because of working on the ENIAC with these women that I really came to love and admire and respect, and I had so much fun with them. And I also feel that I was lucky to have met John Mockley and Press Eckert, who gave my life a meaning that it could never have had in any other way.
During World War II, all across America, women answered the call to help the war effort. Rosie the Riveter and female military units such as the Wax and the Waves were publicly celebrated for doing their bit, and their heroics live on in monuments, movies, and lore. But the women who toiled on classified projects, in obscure and often makeshift labs, faithfully kept their secrets. These young women worked as code breakers, ballistics calculators, and machine programmers. They did not seek recognition or glory, and many of their names are lost to history. But every day that a young woman walks through a door that they opened, the legacy of these women lives on.
It's a day they've been waiting for. They're the first group to be released by the Navy under the point system. Thanks, mates, for a job well done. With peace, hundreds of thousands throughout the country left war plants for the last time, and now we face the problem of reconverting factories. At United States employment offices throughout the country, former war workers line up to register for new jobs. With gas again plentiful, and with new cars and new tires on the way, America will be rolling with a pre-war flourish. Yes,
After the war, returning GIs displaced most of the blue-collar Rosies, who, like it or not, went back to pre-war jobs and roles. But their computing sisters had more options. Marlon Westcoft worked on ENIAC until it was moved to Aberdeen Proving Ground at the end of 1946. She opted to help her new husband establish his dental practice in Trenton, New Jersey, and managed the office, raising 2 children along the way. In 1997, Marlon, along with all the ENIAC programmers, was inducted into the Women in Technology Hall of Fame. One of her proudest moments came when her grandson received an A for his paper about his grandmother's work on ENIAC. Marlon Westcoff Meltzer died in 2008. After the war, Shirley Blumberg married a photographer and assisted at his Philadelphia studio until the Franklin Institute tapped her to work as a mathematician on an aircraft project. Once the project was completed, Shirley left mathematics behind to raise her 3 daughters. In 1947, Doris Blumberg married and followed her husband as he established a teaching career. She had 5 children during these years, finally settling back in Philadelphia, where the sisters raised their families. In 1965, Doris and Shirley formed Twin Realty, the first woman-owned real estate company in Philadelphia. They were advocates of neighborhood integration and helped to found community and arts associations, receiving many civic commendations along the way. Shirley Melvin died in 2009, leaving her beloved sister Doris to continue on as the matriarch of their extended families. Jean Jennings moved with ENIAC to Aberdeen, but in 1948 was hired by John Mockley for an even greater challenge. to program the UNIVAC and BINAC computers for the newly formed Eckert-Mauchly Computer Corporation. Throughout her distinguished career, she worked for major computer companies, receiving many awards for her work as a computer pioneer. Jean Jennings Bartik lives in Collingswood, New Jersey, and travels frequently to lecture on computer history, but maintains that her greatest personal accomplishments are her children, grandchildren, and great-grandson.